Kicking us off is a joint maritime exercise that took place last week involving Taiwan and Japan. You made me aware, Miles, that this is noteworthy especially because it's the first time they've coordinated forces like this actually in over 50 years. According to the Japan Times, the Japanese Coast Guard and Taiwanese Coast Guard conducted undisclosed joint drills Thursday based on a memorandum regarding maritime rescues, and it's the first time that such training has been made known to the public. So the training surrounded search and rescue operations, which is mostly benign. We're not talking about offensive naval vessels here, but still the Chinese were angered by the symbolic exercise and issued lengthy and stern warnings mostly aimed at Japan. So there's a lot here, Miles, but let's start with the significance behind this drill.
Well, the drill is significant not only because it's the first time, as you mentioned, in more than 50 years, but also because of China's reaction. A lot of things that happen in that corner of the world is measured by how China reacted. China normally overreacts, but then we have to sort of dig into why. And the why is actually very, very interesting. The joint maritime exercise between Japan and Taiwan, first of all, it was done by a mutual agreement, is by a treaty-like agreement. This is how big countries resolve their problems. And Taiwan and Japan do have some kind of dispute, maritime matters, but they all resort to negotiation, to goodwill talks over the years. So they solve the problems in a very mutually respectful way. Now they're joined together to enforce law in compliance with the international norm. So that's really, really important. This is a beginning of something that China sees with great worry. That is, it's not just Japan or Taiwan that were harassed and bullied by China in the maritime domain. It's virtually every maritime neighbor of China has this problem.
Right.
China's huge maritime police force is the primary source of all this tension in this region. Japan and Taiwan, and they cooperate on law enforcement, is of great import because it marks the beginning of a pattern in East and South China Sea in joint maritime patrol and maritime law enforcement. That's why it's very, very significant. China sees this, and that's why they react very, very violently. And then on the other hand, also, Japan is a country that has the leadership credentials. Japan normally takes great initiative to do things in East Asia and Northeast Asia. But more importantly, Japan is now cooperating with Taiwan as a sovereign entity and a country, completely ignoring China's protest. This, in a certain way, is almost like a diplomatic breakthrough because there are some real issues that needs to be resolved at the high sea. To conduct the search and rescue, sometimes, China has now created problems for Taiwan, for example. There's a fisherman who was taken by Chinese forces. He's still in mainland China. How do you really deal with this kind of illegal fishing? How deal with maritime clashes? And this is something that's real. It marks the beginning of the collapse of China's diplomatic isolation campaign against Taiwan, in my view, if you ask me.
Wow.
Because Japan doesn't care anymore of China's outrage and threat. Just do what it needs to be done with Taiwan for common defense and the integrity of the international law. I think that's why it's important.
Yeah, I mean, we covered the Taiwanese fishermen. We've covered the altercations with the Philippines. This is just adding to the list and what seemingly is a natural reaction to China's maritime aggression and belligerence. And so with that context now, what is the actual history of Taiwanese and Japanese relations? We'd said this was over 50 years since this kind of thing has happened. So what has led to this, and is there any precedent for Japanese involvement in responding to an invasion of Taiwan if that were the case?
That's a good question. I don't want to be overly elaborate on this. But if you say 50 years, so 50 years go back to 1970s, early 1970s. So, I mean, first of all, many countries have a border dispute with each other. But methods to resolve them are mostly civil and with negotiations and mutual respect. China is different. China resort to intimidation and very crude tactics of clashing boats and deliberately sort of ramming into other people's law enforcement vessels Now, the Taiwan-Japan relationship is no exception, and they have some tensions and some even hostilities. After World War II, Taiwan-Japan relationship was mostly peaceful because of one important factor, that is the United States. The United States was the victor of World War II and was also a literally occupying force in East Asia, particularly Japan, in the 1950s and 60s. So U.S. has a preponderant influence in occupying Japan, and U.S. has a mutual defense treaty with Japan and also with Taiwan as well. Now, the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty is still in force until this day. U.S.-Taiwan Mutual Defense Treaty was effective between 1955 and 1980 when President Jimmy Carter unilaterally ended it. There was an equilibrium of relationship between Taiwan and Japan under the U.S. umbrella until 1970. In 1917, Richard Nixon decided he wanted to make a mess with two major moves. And number one, he wanted to make a rapprochement with the Chinese Communist Party. Mm-hmm. Number two, he wanted to return the occupied Okinawa to Japan. Now, on paper, those were no problems. But if you actually implement these two particular moves, and you got to do a lot of specific things, it is in the specific implementation process that created such a mess. In order to please the Chinese Communist Party, Richard Nixon abruptly ended the permanent big ship patrol in Taiwan Strait by the 7th Fleet. That sort of a lack of U.S. patrol is still going on on this day. Now, return to Okinawa is proved to be very complicated because Okinawa included the island chain of Ryukyu. And within the Ryukyu island chain, there are several tiny uninhabited islands. The Japanese called it Senkakus.
Yeah.
One of which was legally owned by a Japanese citizen. The U.S. Navy, as a matter of fact, had been paying yearly rent to this Japanese owner for this island at $11,000 a year. The U.S., of course, considered other islands within the Senkaku chain as occupied area, so there's no need to pay to use these Senkaku islands as a Navy bombardment target practice area. So the Navy had been doing this for years. Now, the government in Taiwan at the time was under Chiang Kai-shek. He wasn't happy with Richard Nixon's rapprochement with the CCP. He thought that was blindsided, and it was just the cost would be too much. So, as an act of cantankerous expression of his displeasure, in July 1917, President Chiang Kai-shek of Taiwan sent a question to the Japanese Foreign Ministry, asking exactly who are the island of the Ryukyus that should be returned to Japan. More specifically, is the Senkaku island chain part of the Ryukyu island that should be returned to Japan? The Japanese government was taken by surprise because this was never a question to them. So, but nevertheless, because this Japan and Taiwan, they were allies. So Japanese government replied saying that they would form a task force to study this issue. But before the final study came out, the Taiwanese basically landed on this Senkaku island. They put a Taiwanese flag on them. And then they have the slogans like "Long live President Jiang" over there. And this made Japanese government very, very nervous and a little bit upset.
Yeah.
So they immediately announced the ownership of the Senkaku Islands will be non-negotiable. It's Japanese. And this created tension right now. So the Taipei was not very happy. Tokyo was not very happy. So Richard Nixon, advised by Henry Kissinger, decided, okay, you guys just solve the problem and then tell me the result. So the methods they chose was to form a tripartite committee. And the tripartite committee would also include South Korea, which is another treaty ally. So in 1970, the tripartite committee was formed in Seoul. The three governments, Taiwan, Tokyo, and Seoul, got together and to settle the disputes. Only until then, the Chinese government in mainland jumped in. Up to this time, there was little dispute that Senkaku Island belonged to Japan. But since Taiwanese is making this claim, key issue is who should have the legitimate right to represent China? And the mainland China, basically the Chinese Communist Party said the Taiwanese government under Chiang Kai-shek should never have the legitimacy to represent China in the international negotiations on territory. So only then China jumped in and said, you know what, the Senkaku Island belongs to China, represented by the PRC. So that's the only moment China began to make the claim. As you know, the history is very, very interesting after that Taiwan lost the battle claiming the legitimacy of representing China at the major international venues, including the United Nations. China's representation was given to the PRC. Taiwan was kicked out of Vietnam, of the UN representation. But right now, the Taiwanese still claim Senkaku Island, but it was done in a friendly spirit as a normal international dispute. It has signed deals with the Japanese government in jointly enforcing fishing rights, for example. So it's amicably. China, however, in order to basically make a big deal, and that it was the Chinese government representing the China that PRC has taken from the United Nations in 1971. So they were intimidating the Japanese maritime forces around Senkaku almost on a weekly basis right now, sending warships, coast guards, maritime police vessels there. And this is an international problem. This is the number one issue. This is the number one source of tension between China and Japan. That is the ownership of Senkaku Island.
That continues today in China's statement and warnings to Japan. It mostly surrounded condoning and supporting Taiwanese independence and disturbances to peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait. And
one unique feature of the Senkaku dispute is that in the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty, there is one particular unique feature that says that any Japanese territory, including Japanese administered territory, were under attack by a third country, the mutual defense obligation would be triggered.
Oh, interesting.
That also means that Senkaku Island, which are under Japanese administration, will be covered by the U.S.-Japan Mutual Defense Treaty. That's a very unique phrase, and I think it is very important. If we add that phrase to the U.S. defense pledge to Taiwan, that would also include Taiwanese administered offshore islands, Quemoy and Matsu in particular.
Quickly, before we move on, should we expect more maritime drills and cooperation between Japan and Taiwan similar to what we saw?
Absolutely. Not only between Japan and Taiwan, but also between Japan, Taiwan, and all other countries. I definitely can see Philippines and Vietnam join this. Interestingly, India is also interested in this joint maritime law enforcement arrangement.
Well, we'll have to unpack that more. But you did mention Vietnam, which is where we take our second topic. Last week, the General Secretary of the Communist Party of Vietnam, Nguyen Phu Trong, died last week at the age of 80. It seems it was due to natural causes from old age, but nonetheless, it's a regional shakeup with ramifications beyond just Vietnam. So a few things, Miles, I have for questions. When I was reading about Nguyen, a lot of the write-ups highlight this quote-unquote bamboo diplomacy. So can we start there, and then maybe we can use that context to explain exactly why Vietnam has become such an important actor in China's backyard?
Vietnam has become the most coveted country to have a good relationship with in entire Asia for many reasons. Number one, Vietnam is the most bullied and invaded country in entire Asia and Southeast Asia by China.
Yeah, right.
So since the mid-1970s, the Chinese Communist Party has waged all kinds of military operations against Vietnam, from long-lasting military skirmishes in the entire 1980s to full-scale invasion of Vietnam in February 1979. So Vietnam has this very deep dislike or hatred toward China. And that's number one. Number two, Vietnam is also the toughest adversary of China, building up its military capabilities in recent decades. Vietnam also has bought a lot of Russian weapons. For example, half a dozen kilo submarines, and the next generation air defense system, particularly S-400s, modern fighter jets. Vietnam also has bought a lot of U.S. weapons. U.S. Under the Obama administration ended all the Vietnam War era weapons embargoes against that country. So Vietnamese can buy a lot of U.S. weapons, including maritime patrol and some of the anti-submarine warfare capabilities. Vietnam is a communist country. It will be difficult for U.S. and Vietnam to have a treaty signed. But short of that, Vietnam and the United States are comprehensive strategic partners. So that's the highest level of non-treaty relationship. And also, I mentioned Vietnam is a communist country. So is China. So nobody knows the Communist Party's playbook than Vietnam. Vietnamese Communist Party knows the Chinese Communist Party's weaknesses and vulnerabilities because they're all coming from the same school, the Leninist school. Economically, Vietnam is the biggest beneficiary of the China threat dividends. Many countries were bullied by China. Many companies were moving out of China. So the number one alternative to China market is Vietnam. It started with a couple of decades ago when China suddenly threatened Japan with the embargo of the rare earth materials, which were crucial for Japanese automobile industry, electronic industry. So Japan turned to Vietnam to process the rare earth. And follow that, you have a lot of international capital pour into Vietnam for low-cost labor-intensive manufacturing capabilities. So whenever there's companies moving out of China, and then many of them would move to Vietnam. So this is why Vietnam is becoming a very important global economic and trade partner. And for the CCP, however, Vietnam also posed a big fear because the United States has three treaty allies in East Asia and Southeast Asia: South Korea, Japan, and the Philippines. For Vietnam, the country that has a deep hatred toward China, to become the next potential treaty ally of the United States, it will be unimaginably damaging to China's security environment. China knows the power of mutual defense treaty because it was the October 1978 Vietnam and Soviet Union Mutual Defense Treaty that prompted then Chinese Communist Party leader Deng Xiaoping to play the U.S. card. He came to the United States, basically hoodwinked the Carter administration, and used the U.S. as a bargaining chip, as a tool to stop the Soviet intervention for his upcoming invasion of Vietnam, which took place in February 1979. So the Chinese Communist Party knows how to play this kind of treaty ally game, and their biggest fear is that Vietnam will become closer and closer to the United States to become some kind of treaty ally. So that's why when Wen Fu-chuang died last week, Xi Jinping put out a big show of mourning, of friendship for Wen's death. Leading the evening news across China was the 4-minute tribute to Comrade Wen. Xi Jinping himself emerged out of a sort of mysterious absence of a public show, pay a visit to the Vietnamese embassy in Beijing to honor the dead comrade Wen. So the protocol level of Wen's death paid by the Chinese is similar to that of Ho Chi Minh's death in 1969.
So humor me here, but I feel like there's this camp of countries in the region, for example, India, which geostrategically play both sides or all sides of the big power political game very well. They're close with both the US and China. and Russia even, independently. So they can at any given time play one off another for their interests and are never fully 2 feet in with anyone. So would you put Vietnam in that group? And also let me know if my description of that camp is completely a misread and we can disregard it.
Yeah, I would put Vietnam into the same category as in European history, for example, the Kingdom of Piedmont and Sardinia, who played big-time politics and gained Italian's unification in the 1850s, 1860s. And so you might even compare Vietnam to Israel today. Israel is an independent country. It's surrounded by enemy, so its security environment is not really that sanguine. But Israel knows how to play big-time politics. And Vietnam is another country that knows this very well, better than many other countries, even better than Singapore, I would say. Because Vietnam has been a traditional friend of Russia since the Soviet era. So Russia's traditional friend with the deepest engagement is Vietnam. So every time Russia was sort of forced to sell its next generation weapons to China, Russia always makes sure to sell the exactly same type of weapon with the exactly same amount to Vietnam.
Yeah.
So that Vietnam could use the Russian weapons to build up capability against China.
Yeah. I
mentioned about the 6 kilo class submarines, which are very sophisticated, and also the S-400 air defense system that China bought from Russia. They were also sold to Vietnam as well. And Russia and Vietnam, even today, still have a very strong mutual relationship. It was Vietnam that really put Putin to make a strong statement about the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea. You remember several years ago, Vietnam brought the entire ASEAN countries to Sochi, Russia, to have an ASEAN-Russia summit hosted by Vladimir Putin. At the conclusion of that, there was a joint statement. The joint statement sounds pretty much like any joint statement the U.S. would have issued with its friends and allies. It says it's important to respect international law. It's important to have freedom of navigation in South China Sea. So basically, it's an expression of collective desire by the ASEAN countries against China. You mentioned about India. Vietnamese-Indian relationships were very robust. India and Vietnam are probably the biggest victims of China's bullying tactics in that region. So and both Vietnam and India fought wars with India over the border disputes.
Or with China.
With Vietnam, of course, 1979, as I mentioned. With India, there were actually several wars since 1959. But the biggest one, obviously, was the one in 1962. So the two countries were very tensely hostile to each other on the border in the Himalayas region. So Vietnam and India, they have joint oil drill operations in South China Sea. They had a very robust defense arrangement. With the United States, of course, Vietnam has emerged out of Vietnam War era, and the United States responded with reciprocity. As I mentioned earlier, the United States lifted arms embargo against Vietnam, imposed after the Vietnam War, and with strong advocates for a stronger U.S.-Vietnam relationship, such as Senator John McCain and President Bush and President Trump in particular. So the Vietnam-U.S. relationship has been very, very strong. If you recall, it was Vietnam that hosted the second meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un in Hanoi.
Right.
So Vietnam is playing a very active, positive role in the U.S.-Vietnam relationship, and we have a very robust economic relationship with Vietnam as well. So Vietnam is not a small country in terms of global politics; it's a big country.
So finally today, with our third topic, we'll wrap up with news from Wuhan. Thankfully, nothing about labs or pandemics, but instead it's a surge of driverless robo-taxis in the city, which are ferrying people around at a fraction of the price of a human-driven taxi. Gosh, side note, saying human-driven sounds very dystopian. That aside, local residents are flooding Chinese social media with worries that the robo-taxis will disrupt the market take people's jobs, leave them without work, and on top of all of that, they aren't actually safe. So, Miles, can you expand on this a little bit? What's the larger story?
Well, this Robo-taxis in China rolled out by the Chinese company called Baidu, which is the Chinese equivalent of Google. All of a sudden, within a matter of a couple of weeks, many major cities, not just Wuhan, it started with Wuhan. You got tens of thousands of those robot-taxis called Apollo Go. Mm-hmm. And they put on the street. There were driverless taxis, very cheap, very like a Uber without the driver. And for a number of weeks, it was a miracle. The world responded with awe. It actually affected Tesla's stock in the market. Within a few weeks, however, this thing has become a joke, a target of ridicule. If you go to the Chinese internet, you will see there are a ton of videos, mostly on TikTok, and basically making fun of this new phenomenon. Number one, the technology is not really mature enough to make it completely accident-free. There are a lot of cars, they fail to function, so create traffic jams.
Yeah, it's just dangerous.
And there's a lot of sort of a lack of communication or miscommunication between the customers and the cars. So I don't expect this thing to last very long because it was another very, very important development with Chinese characteristic. With Chinese characteristics, that is a rush to make money and without consideration of the other consequences.
Right.
So of course, the biggest victim of this those taxi drivers. In China, the Uber driver, taxi drivers were completely kicked out of the market because the robo-taxis were very cheap. So they use this kind of a subsidized the fare to drive out the competitors. This is typical Chinese way of dominating market.
I think, like you mentioned, this seems to be another example of the party-driven ideology of technological advancement and grandiosity at the expense of everyday Chinese citizens. I mean, how many Chinese people, Miles, see this as an isolated incident, and how many are connecting the dots all the way back to Xi Jinping's authoritarian economic philosophies?
Very well put. I think, Xi Jinping right now has to focus his economic strategy on elevating the quality of Chinese economic operations. That is, he thought China could no longer just produce flip-flops and children's clothes, that kind of stuff. You need high-tech, high-quality products. So I think this is basically in response to Xi Jinping's call for that kind of economic move. Unfortunately, technology is technology. It has to be sort of serving the people in a very mature way, responsible way. Chinese economic policies were sort of motivated by political consideration with a great rush. As Elvis said, only fools rush in.
欢迎来到六度解析新闻背后的多维思考，带你洞悉头条背后的世界。在今日华尔街频道的六度解析中，我们将深入探究时事热点，为你揭开新闻背后的真相。在这个信息泛滥、真相难觅的时代，六度解析应运而生。我运用海量数据、人工智能整合以及专家观点，层层剥析每个故事，通过实时背景数据挖掘，确保你获得全面的新闻资讯。然而，我们关注的不仅仅是数据，更重要的是将它们串联起来。我将分析多方视角，揭示隐藏的脉络，为你提供单一媒体常常忽略的背景信息。无论是政治、经济，还是全球事务，我都将为你带来最具洞察力的分析。试想一下，拥有洞悉全局的能力，做出明智的决策，参与有意义的讨论，这就是六度解析带给你的价值。它不仅仅是新闻分析，更是一种赋能的工具。加入今日华尔街的六度解析，共同探索头条背后的故事。你通往深度理解的旅程，从这里开始。不要只是阅读新闻，要解码新闻，理解新闻，活出新闻。这一切尽在六度解析。立即订阅，不错过任何真知灼见。因为了解真相仅仅是个开始。